I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm actually from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which would explain the coat and the tie, because I didn't realize how warm it would be here, but it is great to be here. The other thing I realize about saying it's great to be here when you step on stage and you're from out of town is you don't believe that. You're like, oh yeah, that's what everybody says. It's great to be here. It's insincere, it's fake, it's just what speakers say. What he neglected to say, or not say in my bio, is that I'm the father of 4 teenage girls. It's great to be anywhere else. So thank you for having me here. It's my respite to come to Arizona and speak with you all. I'm going to talk about content marketing today with a very specific spin. But what I realize is I like to walk around the stage. And there's not a lot of room on the stage, but I'm also vertically challenged. So I'm going to get down here. Are you okay in the back? Or is all you see just like the spike of my hair? It's going to be like I'm a Muppet walking around. You're going to just see that back and forth. But today we're going to talk about the power of visual storytelling. The idea that there's a very specific way to tell a story that impacts the decision-making part of the brain, and hopefully there will be very practical things for you to take away today. But the first practical thing I want to talk about today is that as a speaker in front of an audience like this, I recognize your attention span is limited. Now, if you get up and speak at all, whether it's to 2 people or 200, you got to know your audience's attention span is limited. And there's actually brain science to prove how the attention and retention of people works. It looks like this curve right here. People remember and retain about 70% of what you say at the beginning of a presentation. They remember and retain what you say to the effect of about 20% in the middle of your presentation. And then when you basically announce that you're going to be concluding, they remember 100% after that. So what happens here is I think about presentations, and this is what's going on. I recognize this is happening to you right now. And if you do the math on this, they said in about an hour-long presentation, that opening portion there is worth about 5 to 7 minutes for you. So you get 5 to 7 minutes when people are at their attentive most to give them something they will take home with them. The ending part is a little less than 5 minutes. So if you have an hour presentation, there's about 50 minutes in the middle where your audience could care less what you had to say. So, not wanting that to happen here, I've decided I have to deliberately organize my presentations in light of this, but I have a challenge for you this morning. If you think of this right here, what jumps out at you in terms of that little curve and those numbers if you think right now about your corporate presentations? The one you've spent all this time on, and you're going to equip your organization to go to the marketplace and talk about you. What happens when you see this curve, and what maybe either encourages you or discourages you? Does anybody have a thought or a comment as you see this curve? Waste of time? Why is there a waste of time? Yeah, spend all the time preparing. No one's going to pay attention. So the bottom line is do 7-minute presentations. If you got an hour, say, no, 7's enough. That's all you're going to be able to handle. What they've shown is that the curve kind of works no matter how long or how short your presentation is. There's still a similar curve. What else does anybody think about? What are you thinking about as you see this in terms of the customer's attention and your presentation? Yeah, the meat of the presentation is in that 20%. The meat is in the middle, which is great for a hamburger. Sucks for a presentation, though. So you put the meat in the middle and say, this is where the good stuff's going to be. And then you open like this with your corporate presentations. Well, we've been in business this many years. We've got this many departments in our organization, and they do this. Here's a map of the world. Let me show you all the dots of where we work. Here's that timeline that says, here's all the innovations and exciting breakthroughs that our company's had. Oh, and here's all the logos of the companies that we work with. That's about the first 5 minutes of everybody's presentation. Did I describe your presentations? Congratulations on a distinct lack of differentiation. Because what you did in the first 5 minutes of your presentation is basically tell your customer we're the same as everybody else you're going to hear from because we've got the same 5 slides and they can't tell your client logos from their client logos. They can't tell your map of the world from their map of the world. They can't tell your chronological timeline of breakthroughs from anybody else's, yet you're there to differentiate yourself. You're there to stand out. You're there to be memorable. And at the exact moment that they care and pay attention, You're talking about you, not them. And what happens is after those first 5 to 7 minutes, people go into what I technically refer to as the hammock. It's a very technical marketing and sales term that says basically they've decided what you've got to say is not that different from what they're already doing or what they've heard from everybody else, so there's no reason to pay attention anymore. You know, my survival's not at risk here. If I listen or don't listen, it isn't going to make much of a difference because I think I've seen this song and danced before. So the challenge you have is to think about your presentations in a completely different way and reverse this idea of opening about yourself, but recognize the customer is already inattentive to hear something about them. So stop talking about yourself, and you have to figure out how you're going to open really hot and tell them something memorable and distinct that they will actually write down and retell after you left the room and say, I'm glad I took that meeting. If for nothing else, those first 5 minutes rocked and I got something out of that. Then you have to think of ways to deliberately spike their attention as you're going to war against the hammock. What in your presentation is in there to deliberately wake the brain and get them back engaged? And how do you close hot? The idea is you got to be constantly grabbing and getting what the customer is offering you in your presentations. So you got to be grabbing, hot, and spiky. That is not an HR violation. That is just a new way to think of your presentations. So in those first 5 to 7 minutes or so, you've got to give them something, and you've got to help them leave with something that they'll be willing to tell other people. I've used up about the first 5 to 7 minutes of my presentation, ladies and gentlemen, and I give you my hot opening. Thank you very much. I should stop right here, right? How do I know this is a hot opening? How do I know this is important? Because I see a lot of heads down, and I see doodling going on in your paper. And you're actually writing down 3 numbers, putting a little squiggly line, and putting a few notes in there. It's a hot opening because you are able to take this in, retell it, and I can guarantee you, here's my guarantee, within 24 hours of this meeting, you are going to be sitting in a room somewhere watching a presentation, and you're going to be like, dude, I am so in the hammock right now. Right? And then somebody's going to be like, hammock? What do you mean hammock? And you're going to take out a little notepad, and you're going to draw a squiggly line, put 3 numbers on, and tell them the exact story I just told you. Because I helped make you smarter than you were before you came in the room. With 3 numbers, a squiggly line, wrapped in a story. This is visual storytelling. Simple, concrete visuals that create urgency to do something different than you were doing before, and in a contrasting way, show you that alternative to the way you were doing it. Concrete, contextual urgency, and contrast. Remember those 3 things because they're going to be prevalent in everything I talk about today. But I give that to you as a gift to start this morning. Now, what I could have done is if I was in a smaller room and had a flip chart, I would have just drawn this because it would have been more engaging, and you'd been like, oh, wow, that dude's got skills with a marker. And that would have been really remarkable, but we're in a big room, so I just took my visual and put it up on a board like this. If I was in a real company making a real presentation with a corporate template for my PowerPoint, I could have done the story like this. There's some presentation research out there that shows that 70% of the retention is in the beginning, 20% is in the 10%. I mean, oh, yeah, that's our corporate thing, and we do a lot of bullet points. We should really put visuals in there, ideally some sort of stock photography, because that's going to grab the audience's attention. A big photo with the bullet points, that's going to improve their ability to remember and retain this. Is that visual storytelling? No. You know what would be visual storytelling is if you actually did this. Whoops, where did I go? You put a hammock on there, right? Zen presentations would tell you, what you need is a big, metaphorical, borrowed interest piece of photography. That will solve all your presentation woes. And then, get this, 3 words. That's all you need is 3 words. That is going to change your presentation. So this is where people are going. They're trying to improve upon this, and this is the direction I see, and I offer you this right now. If you think about memorable, remarkable storytelling, which of these really penetrates and provokes you to think about doing something different tomorrow in a way that's remarkable and memorable? which visual story works the best? And I think we're at a crossroads with our presentations, our stories, and the way we deliver content. And that's what we're going to talk about today, that there is a better way. But it has to be visual. My business and what I've done for the last 10 years is study the art and science of sales conversations. Because at the end of the day, nothing happens until a salesperson's lips move for B2B companies. Let's be honest. We can believe that 60% of the buying cycle or 70% of the buying cycle is done until they bring in a salesperson. But I've got some stats to show you that's not necessarily the case. That's maybe what people say, but it isn't what they do. Salespeople with their lips moving still matter, but what happens is salespeople with their lips moving, only 10% of what they say at all gets remembered a week later. It's a study called the picture superiority effect that says, but if you can anchor that message in a simple, concrete visual, so instead of just talking about the hammock and explaining it, actually giving you that simple, concrete visual will improve your retention that 1 week later, the odds of you telling this story and telling it accurately have gone up to 65 or 70%. So this is what I'm kind of banking on with you today, that simple, concrete imagery and visual storytelling is what's going to transform your content. Because what we've discovered is that at the end of the day, all the content you build builds up to this idea of a conversation. And all the good things you do as a company, your new product launches, your mergers and acquisitions, your strategic go-to-market direction, your verticalization, all the things you do to sell, still rely on somebody in the field or over the phone or over the web with their lips moving, making your story happen. Do you believe that? Do you believe that salespeople are still that important? For most of your organizations, somebody has to help the customer see why you're the better offering and why your offering will solve their problems. If you don't believe it, I'm going to share some stats with you. If you haven't seen these stats from the Corporate Executive Board, I would suggest you maybe write them down and ponder this for a second. They identified from 5,000 B2B buyers, they said, what is the deciding factor when it comes to you choosing one brand over another brand anymore today? And they said, when you choose one company over another company, what causes you to pick that company? And I think the results are a little surprising. 9% said it was price. Now, what's funny is when you lose a deal, what do you always hear is the problem? It's price. Price is a problem. Brand and products, 19 and 19%. That adds up to 47%. But the interaction your field salespeople have, whether on the phone, over the web, or in person, still drives the lion's share of a differentiated decision and loyalty from a customer. So why do you think that is? They dug a little deeper in the research, and what they found out is most everybody, if you beat them up enough, can get more or less to the same price. Everybody in most markets are starting to consolidate pretty well, and the brands that are left standing are still more or less pretty viable. There's no sucky brands out there anymore. You may not have a brand that people know, but in most markets, the brands that exist, because of the rigor and the way the social community goes now, if you don't have reasonable brand or product, people know about it, and you're not in business very long anymore. So what they've said is, at the end of the day, the distinguishing element is still a sales conversation, a field interaction that helps me understand what it is or why it is I need to do something different and why I need to buy something. And that distinction is radically different than some of the things we're hearing in the marketplace today about how much time people spend and how much they do without a salesperson, almost poo-pooing the impact of salespeople. I got more stats to quickly show you about the impact of a selling conversation, and then we're going to talk about what makes a great conversation. What makes a great conversation? Is it your ability to know your products, your features and benefits, take the quiz, certify on them, and share those details with everybody you meet? Or is it this idea that maybe you could bring a little insight to your customers about the business challenges, the industry issues, the emerging trends, the challenges those are creating, the risks that are possibly being posed? Well, when they ask at Serious Decisions, hundreds and hundreds of senior-level decision makers, what they discovered is this conversation is 4 times more valuable to buyers at senior levels, where somebody's going to bring some meaning to this idea of what's going on in my industry and how does that impact me, help me understand and see that. And their expectation is that salespeople will have that conversation. Yet if, again, you think about that, 4 times more valuable, think about most of your content, think about most of your messages, think about most of your training, and are you putting 4 times more effort into this dialogue? Or you actually got 4 times more effort here than over here? We see a huge delta in the content that's being created for conversations with customers that err on the side of product-related features and benefits and distinction, as opposed to having anything interesting and insightful to say to customers about what's happening to them, why they need to think about it differently, and what they should do in response. In fact, the research continued and found that 8 out of 10 sales conversations are actually considered failures because they don't live up to the standard that people have set for them. So there's clearly something going on here that's causing a big problem in the market, and we've been able to document the results of that. If you engage in a discussion that talks about you, your products, and why you think your products are the best, and expect that at some point that sales conversation is going to end in a decision for you or a decision for your competitor, what we've discovered is you'd be wrong 6 out of 10 times. That in fact, 6 out of 10 times that customers engage your organization and actually meet up with a salesperson and actually have a dialogue that allows them to get into your pipeline and be graded as an opportunity, that at the end of life, what they've discovered is 6 out of 10 times, that's the majority, right? You have 10 opportunities, 6 of them stick with what they were doing before they met you. They do nothing different. They literally spend no money, they make no decision. Essentially what they're saying is, somebody raised their hand and wanted to talk to you in your organization, and you thought, well, they must need to do something, because why would they want to talk to me? No one wants to talk to a salesperson for fun. I mean, nobody's that lonely that you want to be haggard and pursued and hassled by a salesperson, so they must want to do something. And that inclination says, let's get them full gun, let's show our competitive matrix, let's tell them all about us, why we're the best, here's how long we've been in business, and you go on with your story. And what we've discovered, though, is that 6 out of 10 times, your customers aren't there yet. They're actually out here. They aren't ready to hear about why you. The conversation they need from you is why change. What they need to first decide is, why should I even do anything different? Why should I stop doing what I'm doing today? So when they raise their hand to talk to you, the majority of people are saying, I'm not sure if I'm missing anything, I'm not sure if I'm still okay. And you're like, hey, you want us versus B or C because we've got on our competitive matrix, you know those matrices that you create with features and benefits, and then your competitors to compare, you have more full moons than they do. Yay, we win. And you're out there showing them that when somebody's over here going, I'm not even sure I need to do anything different. So I'm going to go check it out to make sure I'm not missing anything. That's the real conversation that the majority of your customers want to have with your salespeople. What percentage of them want to have that with you and your website and your marketing content? The upstream dialogue, I would argue, is an even greater percentage. You could argue that 80, 90% of the people who first ping are absolutely trying to figure out, do I even need to do anything different, as opposed to why should I work with you? Yet if you look at the way most websites and the most content is organized, you would find that dramatic difference. And I'm going to challenge you today to say that most companies are missing this content, but it is the big win and the big opportunity. And what I want to do with my time is show you why visual storytelling in a specific choreography is the way to break through and unseat the status quo, which is actually a bigger enemy for you than any of your arch-rival competitors. That what people are doing today, indecision and no decision, is the bigger enemy, and how you dislodge the status quo is dramatically different than how you win the competitive bake-off. That's what we're going to talk about today, because it is different, and it requires you to think different about the messages and content you create. Here's how I look at it. First of all, there's support for this idea of living over on the left-hand side of the conversation. Forrester did some research that identified 65% of senior-level decision makers say they will give the business to the company that creates the buying vision. We always said you should get in early, you should set the spec, but now there's actually stats to prove it. That the majority of the time, 65% of the time, you will get the business, or people will give you the business if you establish the buying vision. My argument is that's the why change conversation. So if you needed any validation to say customers are there, at least 60% of them, and lately I've been hearing from companies in insurance and some other markets that it's up to 80% of their major presentations, the client ends up sticking with exactly what they've got. But here they're saying, hey, if you want our business, you've got to actually help us see why we actually need to buy something and do something different. So here's what I want to teach you here today. These conversations are entirely different. It's no longer, here's what we do, Here's why we do it. Here's who we do it for. Here's why we think we do it better. And here's why we're the best benefit and value for you. The conversation sounds something like this. There are things impacting your environment today that are happening to you, trends, issues, problems, threats, obligations, requirements, regulations that are placing a risk on your desired objectives and outcomes. And these things are coming faster and they're bigger than you thought. You are standing on the status quo. The floorboards of your status quo, which seem to be safe, are now starting to leak and they're starting to squeak. Not because we have a new product, but because these things are happening whether we were here or not. Most of the time when you go out to talk to a customer about why they should change, the impetus for their change is you just launched a new product and you have some new features they don't have. So we come in and say, you got to change. Why? Because we now have ABC 6000 with Turbo Durflex technology. So you need to change because we got a new product launch. And the customer's really like, my sense of urgency is driven by your product launch calendar. The difference in the discussion there, moving from YU, is no, what's happening in your environment are these things. They're creating gaps and deficiencies in what you're doing today. It is no longer safe. Not because of what we're selling, because of what's happening to you. And we're going to help you make sense of that in a way that helps you decide what you maybe need to do different. We call that having a distinct point of view instead of bringing in a value proposition. And what I want to talk to you about then is how do you develop and build a distinct point of view and tell that story in a powerful visual way so that you are part of creating the buying vision and the why change discussion, and you are earning more than your fair share of business and defeating your biggest competitor, the status quo. A point of view is actually a storytelling model based on brain science and how the brain makes decisions to change a habit. What you're really doing when you go out there and try to dislodge status quo is the brain is in a habit. And there's a great book called The Power of Habit. If you haven't read that yet, you should. But the status quo and a habit are similar. And you have to effectively wake up a part of the brain that goes on autopilot. Literally, it goes to sleep once the brain has formed a habit. And the brain wants to form habits because there's so much for us to deal with that we want to take things, package them up, put them in habit to relieve ourselves for the next decisions we have to make. And it's awful hard to pull things out of habit because the part of the brain that makes the decision to get into habit or decide a habit's bad and change it goes to sleep because, it's good to have made that decision and got that thing cooking. So, what we're going to talk about here is a very deliberate storytelling methodology that has 4 parts. And you can learn it and practice it and use them in this order. The idea of leading with some insight that tells somebody something they didn't already know about a problem or a missed opportunity they didn't even know they had. Helping them realize that that piece of insight about a problem or missed opportunity they didn't even know they had that's coming at them faster and bigger than they thought is making their current status quo unsafe. It is no longer safe to be exactly where you are. It was back then, but it is no longer now. When someone goes into unsafe mode, they instantly start looking for a new safe. So your story has to then create enough contrast and tell a story about an alternative, new safe way that responds to the things that are making your current status quo unsafe. There's a very specific connection there. And then you need to validate that with proof stories of people who have done that very same thing who are just like them. 4 parts to this story choreography. It's a visual story choreography. What I want to do is walk you through each element here, break it down, and show you exactly how to do it so that when you leave today, you will have a model to go back and judge all your presentations and your content by and say, hey, are we delivering a distinct point of view here, or are we basically telling the same story in the same way as everybody else? So telling them something they didn't know in order to disrupt their status quo and get them to think, wow, there's something going on here that I hadn't thought about. Help them understand that they can no longer stay there. It's untenable, unsustainable. They no longer can stay there because it's not safe. Help them see that there's an alternative where there's contrast enough between the old way, the new way, or the from and the to, so that the brain that's making the decision sees enough value in making the change. And then finally, demonstrating with a comparable story that this is very doable, that you're not putting your life in jeopardy. All right, ready to break this down one at a time? Are we good so far? All right. Insight. People's access to raw information has never been higher than it is today. And the problem with most content marketing today is you are contributing to this access to raw information. We are putting out gobs and gobs of information faster and faster than ever before because there are more and more channels to put it out. The problem is that if that content sucks, all we've done is really speed up the sucking because there's more channels to suck in and there's more opportunity for more people to see the suckiness. That was just a goal of mine to say suck as many times as possible. Remember how I said I got to spike your attention? And since my kids aren't here, I can use the word because it's forbidden in our house. But the access to raw information is exponentially rising, but the ability to process it is going down at exactly the same rate. So the premium that is being paid, ladies and gentlemen, is for those of you who are able to bridge the gap between the access to raw information and the ability to process and take on the new moniker. It's not Chief Content Officer. It's not Chief Marketing Officer. You are Chief Meaning Maker. Your job is to take all those rambling industry insights and numbers and factoids and discoveries and all that information, process it in a way, and then deliver it back to your customer not as more raw information that they need to figure out and intuit or infer what you're trying to get across, but as meaning. Something where they're like, wow, I didn't even see that in there. There's always a crease that people don't see in the data or the factoids or the research or the movements in the market, all those things that they didn't see, they didn't consider. Your job is to introduce that to them, help them see it, reveal it, make meaning out of that. That's the idea of the hammock I drew earlier. I could have just thrown a bunch of statistics at you, but by calling it the hammock and giving you something you could take away as a story and a visual metaphor for what I was trying to get across, you now can actually act on it. Because it wasn't just data, it now had meaning. And there was an inverted, contrasting way for you to rethink organizing your presentations as a result. I need a very hot opening about the customer, not me. I need a hot close because they're going to remember that because that's the most important part of the presentation, and I got to find deliberate ways to spike it in the middle. That is now meaning to you. It's not just data points. That's what I mean. You have to help make meaning. This is some research we did for our book, Conversations That Win the Complex Sale. Senior level executives said, salespeople, in fact, companies in general, got to stop asking 20 questions of us. You have exactly 30 seconds to tell me something I didn't already know about a problem or missed opportunity I didn't even know I had. And your question there might be, hey, how does that work? I thought the customer knew what their problems are. We're supposed to go ask 20 questions to uncover the customer's problems, and then we go solve those problems. What do you mean you have 30 seconds to tell me something I didn't already know? That's counterintuitive to everything we've been trained to do. But you know what those people said to us? You have that opportunity because you see more people that look like me than I do. I am parochially, myopically focused on the issues of my company, and I'm lifting my head off my desk to engage with your organization, hoping against hope. I don't have to listen to the same 5 slides as I've heard from every company, and I get to hear some sort of insightful piece of information that I didn't know, but you know because you see more people who look like me than I do. You see dozens, maybe hundreds of companies and decision makers that look like that prospect every day, every week, every month of the year in your company. They said, just act like that. Act like you know something, because you do. You know things I don't know because I don't get out as much. I can't keep up with all the reading. I don't go to the conferences anymore. I just got to keep the wheels on my company. So there's a real opportunity to share an insight and help somebody see something in a new light, reframe, disrupt their thinking of their status quo. I tried to do that earlier when I tried to share the idea that most companies are focused on the wrong part of the sales conversation or customer conversation. 4 times more important, we usually put 4 times more effort here. Even the 53% versus the product and branding stuff, those things were meant to disrupt with some sort of insight, and the hammock as well, trying to give you a piece of insight that allowed you to say, I need to stay engaged in this conversation because I might learn things I didn't know from somebody who sees more people that look like me than I get to. I'm still engaged. Share an insight in a simple visual story that's no more than a couple numbers, some squiggly lines wrapped in a story. The second part of this is making people feel unsafe. I know what you're saying is our brand doesn't want to go negative. We don't want to be a little dark rain cloud. If you're GE, you're saying, hey, we bring good things to life. We don't want to bring unsafe to people. Well, I'm here to say that unless you do, and unless you think about the brain science that's impacting this, you aren't going to understand what your messaging and content needs to accomplish. Here's the brain science, 20 years worth of brain science, that basically says when someone makes a decision to drop a habit or leave status quo, they use a certain part of the brain to make that decision, which is not the one that you typically message to. Typically, most people message to the neocortex, the part of the brain that loves analytics. I got my ROI calculations, I got my big benefit statements, I've got all the benefits and the value props, and I've calculated it, and here's the story. But what they found when they put someone in functional MRI machine is that it was actually the old brain, and Seth Godin talks about this. He talks about the lizard brain. It's actually the old brain that makes the decision. The idea is you have to wake up the old brain in order for it to say, hey, I got to stop doing what I'm doing. It's no longer safe. The old brain is your survival mechanism. And the survival mechanism makes the decision very quickly on whether what they're doing today is safe enough to stay or whether they have to consider going. The old brain is a very fast decision maker. It assesses a new situation and says, am I okay? Am I safe or not? Just like when your presentation comes in. The old brain says, I wonder if this company is going to make me feel safe or unsafe. Is anything I got to worry about here? Then you start with the same first 5 slides, and the old brain goes, I'm okay. Seen this before. The old brain is the decision-making engine. The new brain is the justification and validation of the decision the old brain took. So the truth of the matter is, in the brain science, this is Daniel Kahneman, 1984, you're like, I went into marketing, I didn't want to go into biology, but hey, this is important. He identified 2 really important theories to decision making. One's called loss aversion, the other's called risk seeking. And what he discovered is people are 2 times more motivated to change a behavior and move off of status quo or change a habit. They're 2 times more motivated to do that to avoid risk or loss than they are to achieve gain. You follow me on that? If they're doing something today and you're trying to unseat the status quo or change their habit, they are 2 times more likely to move based on avoiding pain and loss than they are to achieve some sort of potential gain. And then when you ask someone to change, what is it you ask them to do? You ask them to take a risk. Change is hard. Change is risky. If I'm going to change, I have to actually put myself out there and take a risk. Well, when are people more likely to take a risk? His research proved it. If I'm in status quo, I'm more likely to change or more likely to take a risk, again, in order to avoid loss than it is to achieve gain. So he wrapped up this idea of risk-seeking and loss aversion in a concept he calls prospect theory. So the idea of old brain decision-making coming together with prospect theory says you have to be willing at some point to create a little urgency by showing them the change in their environment or context prior to explaining why your product's so great. I use this analogy because I'm from Wisconsin. That's a tornado siren. And we have these things in our subdivisions. And on Saturdays at noon, they go off. If you're not from there, you need to bring a change of shorts. I'm telling you, it's loud. But what happens is it goes off at a screaming, blaring level, some decibel level that's really not fit for humans, and nobody does anything. They euphemistically now refer to it as the noon whistle because it goes off at 12 every Saturday. But what I noticed is when a dark rain cloud moves in, and that same whistle goes off with the same decibel level, with the same features and functions and tensile strength, it gets a whole different reaction. People clear a park in a matter of minutes. And I thought to myself, being the marketer that I am, wow, how can it be that the same product gets 2 different reactions? Ignored one day, invaluable the next day. Just like sometimes our stories and products and messages get ignored, where somebody thinks it's invaluable, yet it's the same thing. And I decided, because it's not the thing. The thing that makes your thing valuable is the change in the environment it's living in. That you have to show the change in the environment that's causing someone to realize, I might need a new safe, a new alternative. But the first thing you have to do is dislodge the belief that where they are is okay. The tornado siren is not valuable or responded to until the dark rain cloud comes in and says, hey, maybe this thing, you ought to listen to it, because it's ignored on the other days. So the idea of making someone unsafe is very important as the next step. The idea of showing you here that the why you versus why change discussion is imperative for you to understand and get if you're going to avoid this deep, dark pit, this black hole of the status quo. Visually showing you and making you feel viscerally that problem that companies are struggling with and wondering how to escape. The next step then is to show a new safe. Once you've created an urgent context and you've woken the old brain, what do you have to do to the old brain? Why? The old brain is going to have a certain response. The old brain goes into fight or flight mode. And once it decides it's not safe, it wants to find a new safe. And so the challenge is you have to introduce a new safe, but you got to do it in a certain way, folks. Context creates urgency for change, but now you got to give it some place to go. So what I want to teach you about is this idea that you have to make sure if somebody's going to move to your message, that they have to see the pains that they're living with as being more painful than the change you're asking them to make. And here's where most people struggle with this. You ask customers, what keeps you up at night? What problems or pains are you having? Tell me what you're struggling with so that I can respond to it. And then you put a message together, a campaign together, or a presentation together, and they don't do anything different as a result of you talking about the problems or pains they told you about. What just happened? They told you about the problems and pains they are aware of that they're struggling with. But when you brought the answer to solving them, they saw that answer as being more painful than what they were experiencing. Because you did not bring a solution. No matter how much you think you have solutions, you have to start thinking tomorrow, what I'm bringing to the customer every day is not a solution. I am bringing a change management project. Nobody likes change management projects. You think it's a solution. The customer thinks it's a change management project. And if the customer sees the pains that they articulated and then sees the change management project, it doesn't see your change management project as a solution. It sees it as more painful and riskier than what they're doing today. So your job is to make sure that that customer sees the pains they're living with as being bigger than the pain of change. So the question is, how do you do that? You stop doing voice of the customer research. Just letting that sink in for a second. That's one of those spiking moments. Did he just say you have to stop doing voice of the customer research? Okay, I'm going to rephrase that. Stop relying solely on voice of the customer research for your messaging and content. Why? If you want to change someone's status quo, the research has shown they cannot tell you problems or pains that are material or meaningful enough to get them to want to change. They only tell you what they know is happening, and what they realize is, yeah, it's a pain, but I'm not dead yet. That thing you're showing me, that could kill me. You have to think this way because that's living in the customer's story, not your own story. So the biggest challenge is you have to live in a world we call contrast, showing someone what the leaks and squeaks and gaps and deficiencies are and the things they didn't even imagine that are going on with their current processes, systems, and approaches, framing that up and visualizing that for them so that they can appreciate, see the value of, and the virtue in the new way. The from and the to must be visualized, literally visualized for customers, because this is the new idea I have to give you on the brain science. The old brain does not contain the capacity for language. It moves based on contrast. Safe, unsafe. Fight, flight. Stay, go. It's all contrast. Am I okay? Good. Am I not okay? Where do I go? And the challenge is most of companies, ignore this for a second, most companies go out there and share their solution in isolation. You go, here I come to save the day. And you show your solution and say, these are all the features and benefits. This is why it's so great. And the customer looks at it and goes, yeah, more or less I think I do that. The customer can't really appreciate the uniqueness, the value, and the virtue of what you've offered until you bring it up in the light of day compared to what they're already doing. Value and virtue lies in the contrast, not in what you're offering. So until you show contrast, and I mean literally show contrast, I'm telling you, your story has to visually show why it sucks today and what parts suck. And it's not your fault. You made as good a decision as you could. But this is coming, that's coming, that's coming. It's creating new needs and requirements you couldn't have even thought of when you made that previous decision. But as a result, you have some leaks and squeaks that require you to think about new needs. These new needs look way different than what you're solving for today, and they happen to align to this new way we're doing things. And that's how you're going to be helped. The contrast is where value lies. So the new safe has to be very deliberate to show you the old way of doing things that have led to the pain and made it unsafe, but then contrasted it with a distinctly different way of doing things so that you know what they should do, whether or not there's enough value there to make the change. Proof. Most companies and most people, most decision makers in most areas of life live in this product life cycle as you well know it. There are visionaries who say, what took you so long? I already knew I wanted this before you showed up. And guess what? Your message can be the worst message ever. They're still going to buy from you. But you might be deluded into thinking you have great messaging, but they're just visionary buyers, right? Then there's the people that are going to buy because everybody else has bought, so I better buy it because what I'm doing today probably is outmoded and won't last, and so, okay, you got me. But the majority of the people live in the middle market, and in the middle market, the thing they need to know is who else is doing it? Who else is suffering this way, and who else has tried this? Alcoholics Anonymous learned a long time ago that people must self-identify in order to change a behavior. You can't say you are an alcoholic, and they go, you're right. Somebody has to get up and tell a story. I'm an alcoholic. This is what life was like before. These are the leaks and squeaks, the gaps and deficiencies, the struggles, the perils of my life, the things that were coming at me and affected me all because of where I was with alcohol. Here are the new things I changed. Here are the new requirements and changes and considerations in my life that took me to this new place. And I'm doing it this new way. Look at the contrast between that. And all of a sudden the person says, that's me. That is me. The majority of your market needs to know who else has experienced it, how they experienced it, so they can self-identify that this change in behavior that you're asking of them has to take place, and they've decided they got to get there. So you need to tell a story that helps people get there. I'm not going to bore you with our story, but this is one of those things where companies have done this point of view development. They've put it in their campaigns. They've taught their salespeople how to share a distinct point of view as opposed to value propositions and seen incremental growth and change, unstuck, unstalled, previously stalled deals. I'm happy to share these slides. They're going to be up for you so you can look at that in more detail. But the bottom line is you got to tell a great story about a customer or a prospect or a customer who struggled with the exact same things you're talking about, saw the need to change, made the change, and came out well and safely on the other end. And now you have a choreography for a point of view. The point of view is designed to help you break through the status quo, which is your biggest enemy, not your rival competitor. It's an opportunity in marketing and sales to bust open a market because the competitive opportunities are way fewer than the no decision opportunities. And there is a different, very deliberate way to tell a story, create messages, and deliver content. I would submit to you that it is all visual. What you've seen me show you today is very little on the word side, very little on the bullet point side, very specific on the visual side. I hope that you've seen some pictures that help you understand that the story must be concrete. It can't be abstract or complicated, and that a simple, concrete visual creates action. The idea of creating some urgency by showing the environment or context changing around them so that there's a sense I cannot stay there. And then there's contrast between what they're experiencing and where they need to go. I'm going to leave you with this story because it's very important. This is my hero. My dad thought this was Carrot Top without makeup. This is my hero. Most of you know who this is. This is Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book, The Tipping Point. It became a tipping point in his career because millions of copies were sold, and he became famous around the world. He now charges $100,000 to speak for 45 minutes like I just did. Me, I got some branded merchandise. But it's cool. Anyways, tipping point. But you didn't probably know this, that 40 years prior to Malcolm Gladwell's book, a man named Morton Grodzins, a political scientist in Chicago discovered, empirically validated, documented, reported, and published, and literally named the concept the tipping point 40 years before Malcolm Gladwell's book. Malcolm Gladwell was selling all of us a 40-year-old unoriginal idea. Now, I ask you, what was the difference between these two? One originated the idea, the other was 40 years old and borrowed somebody else's content. And the truth is they were both selling us the same idea, the tipping point, but one's a multimillionaire and the other toiled and died in academic obscurity. I submit to you that your products and services are the same way. They can be really, really great, but your inherent greatness may not be apparently obvious to the marketplace. And it isn't because of the product itself, it isn't about the brand, and it isn't your price. It's about whether or not you told a great story. Gladwell told a better story. He messaged it great. What I want to leave you with today is that no matter where you think you are in the parity or commodity scale for your offerings, you can distinguish and differentiate yourself by telling a better story. And with the choreography and the tools that I've given you in this short amount of time today, hopefully you feel more equipped tomorrow than you did coming in here to tell that story better. Now it's really up to you. Who are you going to be? Gladwell or Grodzins? Thank you very much.